Firstly, on setup, what do we, as the elves, demand from this revolution? Obviously, this is an actor motion, so we're able to set this on side of government. There are 4 things that we will demand as elves from Santa. Firstly, equitable treatment, job protections, and the right to unionize and demand for rights. This means that on our side of the house, we're going to demand Santa pay for the types of work that the elf does, which is something that does not exist on side of opposition. Secondly, what we will ask for is things like paid time off and an obligation for Santa to have to pay a part of the revenue that he gains from these types of gift giving, for example, or whatever entity that is giving him money, or maybe in terms of giving them things like toys, for example, to the types of elves in the first place. Number 3, we will make sure that Santa gives the elves the right to choose their own jobs. The problem right now is that because they're being exploited, they are not able to choose the types of job that they want to. They might have to work in the reindeer manufacturing, even if they want to work in toy manufacturing, for example. These are the types of job flexibility that we will get on our side of the house. And the last thing here is that we will make sure that some of the resources that are in the North Pole are used to facilitate things like leisure for the elves and care for the elves, as opposed to all being done for Santa's profit on their side of the house. A few mechanisms on what we're going to do as the revolution. We will obviously be using a range of tactics to negotiate with Santa. For example, we will be doing things like boycotting the manufacturing process so that Santa would have to concede, or he would not have any toys to give out in the winter, for example. In the instance that Santa does not, does not come to agreement with the negotiation and the demands that we make, it is likely that we are going to use things like violence. We will take up we will take up guns, we will take up, pitchforks and fight Santa on our side of the house. Well, I'll talk about 2 things in the speech. The first thing is why we are likely to succeed in garnering these types of demands and why this is substantially going to make the lives of these elves far better. Secondly, we'll talk about even if this is not true, we think that fighting in and of itself is likely to be meaningful. Before that, if there's a clarification, go ahead.
The word revolution necessarily implies the nuance of reversal of power balance.
That's not true. In the vast majority of cases, revolutions do not end in taking the government down. Vast majority of cases, revolutions end in many times a dictator making concessions toward the people on the ground. We think this is a meaningful impact that we gain on our side of the house. Firstly, let's talk about the benefits that are going to be gained, why these benefits are going to be gained for elves on our side of the house, and why the revolution is likely to be successful. The first thing is that elves are likely to have a significant advantage over Santa in a few ways. The first obvious reason is that there's significantly more number of elves in comparison to Santa. And this is pretty obvious from the fact that there are enough elves to do enough manufacturing for every single kid in the world, which probably means that there are significant millions of elves there that are likely to be able to fight on our side at the house. And I want to note clearly here that I think it is very likely that you're going to get buy-in from many of the elves, and you're going to have a coalition that works pretty well. There's a few reasons. The first reason is obviously that the motion kind of assumes that we, as the elves, are doing this, so I think it kind of gives us the fiat to assume this, but even if you don't buy this, there's a few reasons why this is likely to be a collective effort. The first reason is that there's obviously a very strong collective incentive to do this, because many of the elves face this type of bad exploitation. The second reason is that once we are able to gain momentum, it is likely to gain more followers in the future. So maybe we're able to do things like shut down one manufacturing plant. This is seen as something that is hopeful and successful, and therefore you're likely to gain momentum after that, for example, right? The third thing is that we're inherently elves in this context are likely to have a relatively strong bond with each other, which is something that you can read from the motion. Not only because they have things like folktales and their original types of culture that they have probably mean that they don't generally believe that they're like a one species that are with each other in the first place, but also they work alongside each other in hard, dire situations every day, necessarily meaning that many times these elves are likely to have a relatively strong pact with each other and therefore are likely to buy in. And the last thing is obviously we can kind of, counter the narrative, or we can kind of tune the narrative on our side. Many times we are likely to have things like elf-to-elf communication, where they work on the ground and talk to each other. Maybe they even have access to things like telecoms, because they need this to do things like factory manufacturing. And therefore, these types of elves are able to talk to each other and talk about why this is important. This means that elf buy-in is likely to happen. This means that we have much more elves, much more people fighting on our side of the house. The second reason why elves are so strong is because they have access to manufacturing, which means that they have access to things like heavy machinery. They have access to things like guns. They have access to things like creation of guns if they want to. They have access to things like materials. They also probably have people like engineers, because if they don't have engineers, they can't make things like scientific toys for children on the ground. This means that they have significant levels of high power to be able to do things like create weapons on our side of the house. The third reason is because they have significant entire control over the profit model that Santa has. This means that if Santa does not have the elves work, his profit model goes down, he cannot deliver presents, and that is obviously very bad. This is uniquely different from a lot of types of things like other countries and revolutions, because many many times these other countries have things like pathways to get away with this. They can do things like not get sanctions. Obviously, that's not how it works for Santa, because the only lifeline that he has is the elves working on doing things like making presents. The last thing is that obviously elves probably have a lot of information on Santa. Not only because there's probably elves working alongside Santa, taking care of them, for example, so they know the weaknesses of Santa, etc., right? The comparative here is that Santa is weak. A, because he's old and he's probably likely to be weak. 2, because he's just one person, as opposed to being like an elite class or an army of people. So you can't imagine situations like, Iran, for example. This is not Iran, this is one Santa. But the third thing here is that I don't think he has magical powers. And I can read this from the motion in 2 ways. The first reason is that he cannot magically fabricate the, lots of toys that we have right now. He's making the elves do this. Necessarily mean that he doesn't have the power to randomly create things, which probably means his magical powers are relatively limited. But also secondly, the reason why the elves are staying here, as written in the info side, is because they believe that they can't get out. It's not that Santa is actively using magic to force them down. Probably means that Santa can't do this, so therefore Santa having magical powers is probably out of the debate. Santa is relatively weak. Why is it that Santa will accept this on their side? Not only did I explain to you that this will entirely take away his only source of purpose, which is to give presents to children. He will not be able to do this. Obviously, he has the incentive. But why would Santa choose a way of concession and peace as opposed to being more violent? 1, because this is better than him, being taken out of power. That is the worst fear that Santa has. If we are able to strategically negotiate and say that you can keep power, but make sure that we are having good, good types of work, good types of healthy types of work, for example, this is something that Santa is willing to accept because he fears being taken out of power. But also secondly, if he goes hard on these elves and kills them, this increases the momentum of the movement, which means that at the point in which he kills a bunch of elves, there's likely to be more elves that are going to join the movement and make it stronger. It's a difficult situation for him that if he doubles down, it harms him more in the future, and therefore Santa has an incentive to accept this as much as possible. That is the way we give benefits. Obviously, that is important because we stop exploitation, and we make sure that on our 10th house, we can make up for all the people that have died in the past, all the elves that have died in the past. Obviously, this is the utmost incentive for us at the end. But lastly, even if it doesn't succeed, this is meaningful because I think the slaves that fought for the abolition of slavery, the women that fought for the suffrage movement that died, I think they were meaningful causes. Not only because they're able to break out of the monotonous lives under control that they have no choice under, but it's because this gives them meaning, a sense to live for the future and tomorrow because they're able to do something with purpose. All this means that the elves should take up arms, and they will. Proud to propose.
Cool. I think PM, I'm inviting you up on
Am I audible?
You're audible.
If you need your voice, please stand up. Maybe I can realize. So, I'm gonna ask my speech. 3, 2, 1. My speech, I'm talking about 3 things. Firstly, calculation the elf itself as a counterfactual itself. Especially why. Secondly, why was firstly revolution in of itself is not succeed. Why even succeed is more no happier for elf itself. Lastly, why counterfactual outside comparatively beneficial. Firstly, calculation of firstly elf itself. That maybe 2 calculated firstly exist. Firstly, elf maybe have different characterization, right? Different characteristics comparatively human. It means those elves have a lot of the more generalist more than general human. Also maybe elves have longer ear than general human, right? Maybe comparative characterization of general human is the first place. Also, maybe elf is maybe have making toy itself maybe become identity for the elf itself. Simply because your friend, your family, your brother also making toy itself, also making toys from ancestor. It means making toy itself maybe become identity for elf itself. Therefore, even to some exploited, maybe we may be proud of to making toy to deliver child in the first place. Therefore, maybe those characterization elf look like. The second counterfactual. This government say revolution. Revolution is as in completely changing current power structure, right? It means like maybe elf is try to beat current Santa, try to kill Santa or try to beat Santa, try to control to making toy. Something like that. Those power structure changes is try to changing power structure. It's revolution. It's me. but its completely opposition side of the house counterappears. This means that outside of the house may be taking more soft stances. It means we're not taking guns. We only negotiate with Santa. We try to say I do strike. Therefore, I get more. I think. Revenue, something like that. Those negotiations uniquely doing outside the house. We're not doing negotiation. We're not doing revolution in the first place. In that context, firstly, explain why revolution is not succeed in the first place. I have three such reasons why revolution is not succeed in the first place. Firstly, less join is simply more likely. It's currently evil. It's maybe is continuously thinks that outside world is full of fear. In that context, maybe those able is continuously huge incentive to actually let's join those active revolution. It means simply because after revolution we have to go into the outside of the world. Therefore, you want to avoid those outside of the world. Maybe actually less incentive to join. Also, those maybe evil. Maybe I think feel things for Santa, right? Because actually give you a job, give you identity. In that context, actually less incentive to join revolution, try to kill Santa or beat Santa in the first place. Also, maybe Santa have magical power, right? Says Nasa-san say like don't have magical power because those people cannot making your toy by their own. But it's true, but also true, right? As Santa deliver all child by night or one night, right? Because that's mean have outspeed, have a lot of power, right? Even not have creating power, maybe at least physical power at least exists. It means like I think those able to beat evil easily. Lastly, those cast out maybe in that context, maybe revolution is not succeed, right? This is so crucial because that three impacts actually exist. Firstly, if revolution not succeed, the evil get a lot of damages physically or mentally. Right? It's obviously huge trouble. Also, secondly, maybe Santa have a huge incentive to more pressurize, make workplace more worse, simply try to not make revolution again and again. Therefore, evil has to work in more workplaces. Okay.
The reason why Santa can deliver all the presents is because the reindeer are strong, not because Santa himself is strong.
Santa used those label animal to evil, right? So to beating revolution. Therefore, maybe anyway, doing that. In that context, firstly, secondly, maybe revolution is not succeed. Impact is so worse. Secondly, even if not succeed, why it's more terrible? It's firstly, I think more maybe those evil may be facing a lot of discrimination, right? In that maybe opposition side of the house after revolution is happened, maybe evil is have to working in outside of the world. It means right, but it's different. The evil have a lot of huge different characterization of the human. In that context, human actually huge incentive to discriminating the evil getting out huge discrimination, right? Therefore, actually huge trouble. Also, like maybe those evil have to continuously cast out on your outside of the world, even after revolution. It means that even those discrimination needs not happen. Maybe continuously cast out on outside the house. It's continuously make your emotion is more worse. Therefore, it's a more in our opposition side of the house. Even success is not revolution is not succeed. Maybe its result is more worse. It's completely outside of the house. Why it's more beneficial? Firstly, outside the house, at least more soft negotiation more likely to happen. Government explain like I can see government analysis. Maybe some incentive to get negotiation, make workplace more better because toys necessarily have to deliver toy. Also, like maybe evil is more able to casually join those negotiations simply because like not beat Santa, not kill Santa. It's not getting damaged yourself. Therefore, maybe more able to casually join. It's more able to succeed in negotiation, right? Also, even if negotiation not succeed, maybe anyway, if Santa has huge incentive to make workplace more better, right? Because Santa has to necessarily deliver a toy. It means that in order to avoid those revolution or negotiation, Santa huge incentive to make workplace more better. Even if like those negotiation or revolution is not succeed, at least without like damage not exist, at least evil is continuously making make better while feeling proud of the making toy. Therefore, at least emotionally comfortable, uniquely existing governments opposition side of the world. Therefore, we very proud to about it.
Cool. I thank the LO and thanking the DPM and the very
マジカルサンタの話をその話でもしてきて
2回聞いたことある。Okay. Yeah, gender pronouns are he. Time will start. 3, 2, 1. My speech will be incredibly simple. There will be 3 things in my speech. First of all, direct engagements with what Elo has given us. Second of all, I'll explain to you why Santa is more likely to concede rather than to fight back against these kinds of elves. And lastly, I'll explain to you why closure is an extremely important impact that is probably going to be debate winning in this round. So first of all, a couple of things of engagements to what Elo gives us. The first thing Elo gives us is this idea that, leaving North Pole is going to be very scary, and therefore it's unlikely that people are going to actually, join in these kinds of protests. I'll first just engage with this idea. The first thing to respond to this is that, first of all, I just don't think this idea of North Pole, the life outside North Pole being extremely scary is that strong of a notion within these kinds of communities, which is to say, because of the fact that this motion slide only says this is obviously a folktale, right? It's unclear as to why people are likely to internalize these kinds of folktales to such efficient and deep degrees. It's likely to be something that, for example, just existed as a narrative when they were very young. It's not something they really care about. It's probably stuff like Bloody Mary or like stuff that, you used to believe in when you were young, but you don't really believe in that much. But second of all, it's very easy for leaders to also try to push more likely kinds of counter narratives, especially given the fact that they want to control these kinds of narratives to be able to mobilize these people to turn up and protest, which suggests to you that they might even say that it's actually better outside to go outside and look outside because there might be better life outside of North Pole, for example. The second thing to point out under this is that I think it's likely that you already have rationalized that North Pole is also not much better, which is to say that you obviously don't have any kind of compensation. You don't have time to spend with your family, for example. So it's really deeply unclear as to why you would think that North Pole and life inside North Pole is something you certainly really want to prioritize. I think it's highly likely that a lot of people will find that, it's something worth fighting for, even if they do truly rationalize that life outside is something very scary. The third thing I would also point out is that I also think that being realistic in this motion, I think some people will have left, and I think there's going to be a lot of stories within these kinds of communities, right? Because if people have a very strong interest towards talking about life outside the North Pole, which I think, any kind of creature would, because, humans wanted to talk about what would exist in Americas when they were only in Europe, for example, which suggests to you that I think it's very likely that people are going to have a lot of stories about what happened when you leave, and some people who defected from North Pole because of, life being too harsh is likely to be something that spreads, and I think there's going to be a lot of diverse kinds of speculations and narratives, a lot of opportunism, and people trying to wonder about what kinds of life exists out there. And I don't think we're going to say that this narrative is likely to be inherently extremely positive, but what the point of this is that I think it creates a lot of uncertainty about what actually exists, because oftentimes these stories and speculations tend to mix up over time as communities spread ideas word even mouth to mouth, which suggests to you that oftentimes the idea of North Pole being extremely scary is something that is highly vague. The last response I'll give to this is that I think it's just unclear why you're actually going to be ousted. It's unclear why the Santa Claus is likely to try to punish you in this sort of radical way if we cater to the characterization that life outside North Pole is so scary. If it is true that, and I'll also explain to you next then why Santa Claus has incentives to sort of not use very radical measures. So anyways, the second thing we get from Elo is this idea that, it's very bad for you to use, the Santa Claus can use a lot of magical forces. That's very scary. You don't want to get killed. Obviously, you don't turn up to these protests. I don't think this is very likely. I don't think Santa is likely to react to you in this very bad way. And the reason why is because, first of all, oftentimes when you use this, the long-lasting impacts of you using violence is likely to be long memories of violence that was exerted onto you as a collective memory within these elves. They're going to remember you as this really, really bad person. And obviously it creates a lot of long-term issues about collaboration, for example. People are going to be less trusting of you, which obviously is not something you would really want to happen or cause as a Santa Claus. But second of all, I think it also just means that what we already explained to you from PM, which is that when you do these kinds of things, it is likely that it invites a lot of escalation. It means that you obviously lose the most important interest you have, which is to be able to create a lot of things and goods for to give out to children. And obviously, if that is the case, you would want to choose other means of actually negotiating. The next thing I'll talk about, the second thing in my speech, will be about why Santa Claus is likely to concede. Before we move on, anything? Okay, so the first thing I want to point out is that I think this demand, as we already characterized, is not actually that big of a demand, right? Obviously, this is just about things changing how you can, choose what kinds of jobs you want to. It's not as though you're going to lose everyone in this economy, for example. So I think that the requests we're making are pretty reasonable and fundamentally feasible. I think it is their burden to prove to us why it is fundamentally unfeasible for you to make these kinds of smaller changes, especially when you consider the fact that, for example, elves can just grow in numbers, or, Santa Claus can use a bit of his magic here. The second thing to point out is that I think it's also true that Santa Claus might just have been unaware of these kinds of biological differences, which suggests to you that he's happy to sort of cater to, he's not fundamentally opposed to satisfying or appeasing these kinds of elves, and that they're likely to sort of be, Santa Claus will accept these kinds of facts, that these, in the biological capacities of these kinds of elves, they're likely to be very easily tired, for example. They want more choices. So it's likely that Santa Claus is happy to accept these kinds of things. Third of all, I think it's also true that it creates a lot of long-term division when you use things like violent crackdowns, as I previously mentioned, which means that you don't want to cement this kind of long-term division, because obviously that is a far bigger harm on your capacity to create a lot of presence, for example, which means that oftentimes you don't want to use things like violence. You don't want to piss off these kinds of people. So it's likely that you're going to try to accept these kinds of things, especially if these demands are not that harsh. The last thing I'll talk about is about why closure is really important in this debate. The first thing to prove here is about why liberation, in the sense, why the attempt for liberation in the process itself is particularly a strong and liberating feeling. The first thing to point out here is that right now they have a very strong sense of powerlessness, right? Because they are aware of this kind of exploitation. But the core reason why they aren't able to fight against it is, for example, stupid narratives that, life outside North Pole might be scary. It makes you feel very powerless and you aren't able to really get any kind of happiness in your life. You feel like there's a lack of agency. So obviously when you're able to act on these kinds of dissatisfactions, that is likely to provide you a lot of meaning. But the second thing to point out is that insofar as this kind of exploitation is quite severe, like you, for example, don't have any time to sleep, or you don't really have time to go on vacation with your elf families, for example, that is likely to mean that you have already lost a lot of sense of meaning in your life. It is likely to feel like as though it is something like this life is not really important for you, right? Which I think at the end of the day, obviously it really, really sucks for you, and you want to be able to take a lot of action for these kinds of things. So I think at the end of the day, when you're able to actually engage in this process, it is likely to feel really, really good. Why? The first reason why is because you can feel like you have a shit ton of control, which is something you're just not used to, right? Like, for example, you're able to unite under a strong sense of hatred towards authority. That is something that oftentimes unites people in a very special way. Look at, for example, how people unite very well when they're fighting against a team or watching Japan fight against Netherlands, for example. That creates a strong sense of unity, but also it creates a common enemy and a strong narrative that cuts through the entire community, which creates a strong sense of unison that is likely to feel very empowering when you're in the process of fighting against these people and trying to take on guns or whatever. Second thing to point out is that I think you can also just inherently challenge the control of Santa Claus. And obviously these are people you don't really like, right? Like it's very likely that when Santa Claus is forcing you to not sleep as you tend to a reindeer, for example, that is at the moment in which you develop a strong sense of hatred towards the situation you're put under and the authority of Santa Claus, which suggests to you that oftentimes the fact that you're able to just delegitimize his control is likely to be quite important in this debate.
Cool. I think you can yellow another lady.
I'm audible.
Yeah, audible.
Violence always makes pushback. It's not clever for small elves to antagonize huge, mysterious, prestigious, godlike men. First of all, I want to talk about the definition of revolution and what's the comparative of this round. They said, we would like do negotiation and in a clever way. I think it's clever for government to set up in that way, but I don't think that is the definition of revolution. Revolution necessarily implies upside down of the power balance structure, right? Therefore, I don't think it's the definition of revolution to support some tactics that's like clever, to negotiate in a clever way. Then, but also, even if we bite the bullet, I think PM's analysis imply that elves have access to guns. I think that maybe implies the government think it's okay to use violence. So we say it's not okay to use violence. So what's the comparative on also the house? We would say that only through the clever negotiation, I would say the true improvement of their own working environment happens. So why is this? Why is this true? The first reason for this is because we give why is this true? Because we give Santa the bigger some room to hear and to negotiate with elves, and they're not Santa are less panicked and Santa are more calm. So the first So before talking about the structural reasons why there is the improvement, I want to talk about the characterization of Santa. I think Santa is basically a good guy if they are not exposed to the danger of violence. But Santa don't treat elves as human, like we don't treat pigs or cows as human. But the nuance here is simple. I eat cow and cow dies, but this doesn't mean I'm a bad guy. But I still have imagination. But also I sympathize with those who have some sort of intelligence. And that is a so important point. I don't think Santa, they themselves are so bad guy, but they have a room to consider and have a room to sympathize to the situation of elves only when they are not exposed to the danger. Then, why there's improvement in also the house through the negotiation? The first reason for this is because Santa is definitionally a Christian guy who is respected by so many people, and probably they went through some hard training, I don't know, and I think they purely believe in Christian theology, and for example loving neighborhood and so on. I think that he have the capacity to general capacity to sympathize other intelligent actor. But second reason for this is because Santa also wants to improve efficacy of their own factory, and as the government said, and I do think even through the clever negotiation, I think the Santa also hears the idea of the elves. And but what will happen in this house is that this will necessarily antagonize Santa. And the point then couple of response on revolution in the definition of their server house. First of all, they said, we get united. Then all elves agree with the revolution in the definition of government. Then it's okay. I don't think so. Why? Yes.
Pigs and cows cry and say that they do not want to be killed. We still kill them. The only way Santa will concede is if we give him enough sense of urgency to do so.
I don't think so, because NASA, we're talking about the issue of human, but we are talking about Santa, who is not a human. Then, on first bird and fish, they said, all elves get united. I don't think so. Why? Because some elves want revolution. Some elves
want to keep their own life. Why? Because they purely believe in the myth that like outside is so dangerous. And also, I think some people are happy to work, for example. Objectively speaking, maybe they are exploited. But objectively speaking, we are also exploited by companies. Then what we are actually thinking is that, our life don't have any hope. But we find some meaning and we find some identity in our work. And for example, while like we are exploited by so many consulting firms, then what's happening? And so how do we find identity and how do we find joy in our job? That is, for example, like having some shit talks with peers, or for example, like purely getting into the work and continuously telling us that this is my identity and so on. So what's happened in their server house? They lose that kind of identity, which like elves might have been enjoying. Why? Because no. We say elves are so weak, as you have already explained. Then what will happen is that they are so. What will happen is Santa will suppress the elves for a larger extent in their server house. Why? Because even if Santa is a good guy, they fear as well. And as government team like describe elves as so strong entity, Santa's fear towards future possible like revolution get bigger. Then, therefore, like Santa also what Santa would do is, for example, one, monitoring the elves for all the time, or for example, limit access to like some machine or guns and so on. But third of all, that Santa don't let elves have any conversation among them for deterring next planning of revolution. I think this is so likely. So what's the implication of this? Implication here is, first of all, elves feel more pressure all the time because they are seen by Santa all the time and they have no any like freedom to talk to other people. But second, they are unable to find any meaning through their own lives because they are unable to like, for example, share their own situation with their peer, or they cannot like talk about their own identity and so on. So what I want to suggest is they might be enjoying their own lives, but they will lose because why? Because they choose to like to use violence. Then we would say as a conclusion, Santa may be good guy, but any good guy can be panicked when they are exposed to danger. Santa is not a human. Santa is godlike man, but those men maybe also get panicked. And also we can achieve exactly the same goal as government, even without violence. We win.
Wait. The Discord is like,これ大丈夫かな?
さっきのやつ聞こえてた。絶対ダメじゃない?
Oh no. Should we call someone? Discord すいません。
ゆうかさ、どこまでこれさ、なんか今繋がらないんだけどさ、どこまで繋がってたの？
わからないです。
ちょっと聞いてみるか、ちょっとこっちで入る。
お前の渾身のスピーチ聞き取れない。
Hi Raymond, can you hear us? I think our device on in our room dropped, so I joined in from my phone. To what point were you able to hear us?
Oh, I was able to hear the final part of Utah's speech.
So did you hear the entirety of Yuta's speech?
Yep, I did hear it.
Okay, so that's great. So we were just going to move on to the next speech. So we'll go in from this phone.
Yeah, okay, sure.
一応カメラもつけとく。
ありがとうございます。
よいしょ。
starting in a few seconds. And I'm just checking if I'm audible.
Yeah, you're audible.
Yeah. I'll prove three things. First, why this revolution will succeed. Secondly, why this is unique, i.e. why this won't succeed under the side of opposition. Third and finally, the importance of it, irregardless of whether it succeeds or not. Before anything else, I want to just clarify the meaning of revolution, because opposites, it's both violent and it attempts to overthrow the pre-existing government, i.e. Santa. But note the existence of the definition of revolution, which suggests that it is a sudden and a fundamental change in how something works and how something is governed, which means that it is not always a direct attempt to overthrow Santa. And the intuition prompts to just by our definition is things like the, for example, Marxist revolution in theory by Marxism, oftentimes involves not just the violent revolution that happens externally, but also internally voting through the democratic systems. But also intuition prompts is things like there exists peaceful revolution, and therefore NASA's argument from the beginning stands. And I think it is fair to point out things like we just giving more equitable or like demanding more, like for instance payoff, or for instance vacation, for instance the ability for them to just demand things like the ability to care for other individuals. But we are just obviously perfectly fine with it taking the hard stance of violence, and all of our argument was incontingent of it. And the implication of this clarification is just critical, because many of the Allo case falls. Many of the Allo case was reliant on the idea that elves will move away from the Santa's world. But with this definition, firstly, we think that the internal change within the Santa world is possible. But secondly, even taking their definition, they never explain why the elves have an active incentive to move away from the Santa's world, not just, for example, govern the Santa's world in their own fashion, which is why their argument in human discrimination doesn't work. But additional mechanisms. Firstly, I would argue that humans have a mutual incentive not to have discrimination for a few reasons. One, because as they say, Santa and probably elves just perceptually have magic, therefore it is scary. You would obviously not bully them. Two, because you obviously don't want full-scale war with those elves, presumably. We, on both sides of the house, agree that there are many elves. But secondly, I think you just generally have empathy towards them. Elves are just cute guys. But thirdly, I think elves can pick and choose the specific world they want to live in. So for example, in instances where discrimination is that severe, I think elves can actively choose to stay in their world as opposed to just eternally live in humans' world. First question, whether revolution succeeds. I want to note that a lot of the mechanism we provided you from first is just not responded to. We told you about how numerically there's a lot of elves and therefore has the capacity to just fight back against Santa, or the fact that there exists a lot of buying from elves, or the fact that you have a lot of information of Santa because you've lived with them for decades. The only response is a one-liner silver bullet, which is to say Santa is strong, which is, to be fair, a parallel analysis to the three mechanisms NASA tells you about how Santa is old, about how Santa is a one person, or about how Santa only has a limited power of magical power, and therefore I think their mechanism is limited to begin with. But even if you don't take that, here are a few structural deadlock breakers as to why our characterization is likely to be true, i.e. why the revolution will succeed. The first reason is, I think I would note that the revolution, regardless of whether Santa is strong or not, stops a lot of the manufacturing process, which means that it creates a lot of the inconveniences that the Santa presumably do not have. And therefore, the easiest ways in which you want to just resolve the situation is by, for instance, compromising on specific issues rather than doubling down on it, which is why I think even if Santa has, for example, the capacity to break down on those individuals, they would obviously not want that because it takes away a lot of the resources, a lot of those particular things. But the second independent mechanism is they're scared of escalation. Note, escalation happens more from discontent of the elves on the ground rather than their actual capacity for them to just determine whether it works or not, which is why their counter-analysis and how things like, oh, Santa will fear that they will get overthrown and therefore they would double down simply does not work, because these elves that are going to the roads to fight back against Santa are already willing to risk their life for change, which is why I think in instances where the situation is severe, i.e. there exists exploitation, there is diminishing the incentive for them to stay away from revolution and keep working for Santa, and therefore it is unlikely that the Santa will double down and escalate on the violence, which is why I think our characterization is likely. This proves why violent revolution is likely to succeed under our side of the house. Second thing I want to prove why violent revolution is more likely to be effective in making change than their counterfactual and weak attempts to negotiation. And I would explain why their attempt ultimately does not work. For a few structural reasons. One, because you signal that you are not silent uniquely on our side, because we are more than happy to use violence in instances where it is necessary. We are able to do things like coercively create change, or the fact that we signal the possibility of using violence in the future means that the Santa has a unique incentive to preemptively stop things like exploitation uniquely on our side of the house. Whereas in the comparison and opposition, the best case of opposition is, yes, the change might happen, but the Santa is not scared, and therefore they are much likely able to resort to things like exploitation in the long run. Secondly, we use active violence means that there exists spillover effect and collateral damage, as they themselves point out, which means that from the lens of other elves has an active incentive to pressurize Santa to stop this to begin with, and the best way they stop this is, as I have already pointed out, I think this is things like active de-escalation or bettering the situation for elves on the ground. Before I move on to impacting, I'll take a point. Sure, let's talk about the reason why this is debate winning. The first thing I want to note is their argument and how, oh, you're already exploited in status quo and that the individuals can derive meaning from it. Obviously, the extent of exploitation that elves are facing on the ground is utterly different from the exploitation that we are facing under the capitalism. Because the intuition pump is, elves are willing to go so far as to literally risk their lives and fight back against the one single dictator, which is Santa, which is presumably the reason why the degree of exploitation that they're facing is utterly high. Therefore, the fact that we succeed, or even if we don't overthrow Santa, the fact that we are able to get some conditions that improves uniquely in our world is a unique impact that we derive in our side of the house. But secondly, one impact that they never respond to was the analysis we provided you from DPM as to why we provide meaning in a unique process of revolution to begin with. For instance, think about how Jewish in the 1940s under the Nazi had two options. They had either the option to second or just give their best shot. And the reason why they did the latter, which they ended up dying, but this still gave them meaning, was the fact that the act of rebellion in and of itself is cathartic. The fact that they have stayed silent for decades, the fact that they had to give in to the demands of the Santa, even regardless of them succeeding or not, the fact that they can just express what they want from the bottom of their heart in and of itself provides meaning, and this is a certain impact as well. And therefore, our path to victory is not contingent on our probability of success. For all those reasons, Trump wins.
Cool. I think definitely will help with a bit.
To start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Raymond, if your colleague said, aha, there are revolution on our workplace, and your colleague said, aha, we have the extra paid leave, I think, do you think this is a revolution? The intention pump from the government whip is like the if we have the revolution is a multi the umbrella term, you have the soft. This is not necessarily mean the overthrow of the government, etc. But I think the end income that NASA-san tried to prove is not that strong. To the extent of the government that try to claim the end income, the outcome they want to claim is how we have the pay leave, the pension system onto the elder or etc. I don't think this is not answering this question. But the intuition pantheon from opposition web here is the Iran Revolution, the Arabian Spring Revolution in Iraq. Do you imagine the paid leave is given by the to the citizens on the ground? I don't think so. So let's talk about the motion time back to begin with. I think there is a logical leap in the government. You cannot do the too much favor to their cases. On the first two things, the first thing they start talking about, Santa is really evil guy, evil really guy to bring the children, toys with a questionable reason, but they do use violence and exploit the elves. I think, but on the other hand, other counterfactuals they want to claim is they have how you can the Santa also has the incentive to hear of the small demand, therefore they can succeed. I don't think that why the Santa what the kind of Santa's characteristic is true in God paradigm. Secondly, in the piece, I think they talking about how we have the small demand, but we also use the guns. I don't think why you can use that gun to achieve the small demand. I think these you cannot take the the end income they want to claim and the how can I say the process of it. You can do them the favor. So second part of my speech is the weighing. I think the three weighing that I want to talk about. The first thing is why in we win is the impact is a sequential. The note that in the both sides of the house, the fake story is with somehow deliberate, somehow revealed in the elf. The key distinguish between the God and opposition is approach to that fake stories. And God paradigm, in God they have to claim the revolution, but we are negotiation. The first weighing is our impact is the sequential. The government will try to claim, we can use a signaling effect by selecting Santa to use the violence. I don't think this gives a huge pushback. Raymond, please imagine you are here. I have a gun and I can use the gun to pull trigger. Can you adjudicate this one in the proper manner? I think at the moment which you use a gun, you use the violence. It's a key distinguish between your success is 0 or 100. But on our side, how we use a P4 manner, even if you cannot achieve the end. The extra 5 days of paid leave, we can demand, we can negotiate the 3 hours of leave, or at least we can compromise the end count. So I think the implication of this, the impact is not so sequential. You can take all the argument or entire cases, but or not. So second wing is the feasibility. That's three things to say. The first thing I want to talk about is the NASA's demand, NASA's doubt about the Santa is not strong, but the strong is a deal. I don't think this is a proper analysis because the people who are strong the most is the people who can control the power. I don't think the CZ pin is the most strongest guy in the combat, but he is strong because he can use the power. So the deer is strong. Santa can use that power, and so he is strong. The second thing I want to talk about is why our side feasible is that people. We won't threat the Santa off. We can use the strikes and the unification form, the boarding, the lobbying, etc. But on their side, at least they have to use some violence to achieve that. We can the signaling effect to the Santa if they piss the Santa off. I think this is crucial because the government side try to claim Santa is really violent. If he takes that case, you cannot threaten that evil guy because there the expectancies of the huge pushback. The third thing I want to talk about feasibility issues that you can easy to unite on our side of the house. Note, there are at least some sort of the power balances Santa between the elves. We have to unite to succeed the goal. But on their side of the house, they might be doubts on that. What they have to prove, all the elves can unite and can to attack the Santa. But on the other hand, they have to. It will be the traitor and the whistleblowers. There are some guys who try to hey Santa, you know, there are some guy who the thinking of the bad thing, etc. Their whistleblower can spoil any of the unification effect on their side of the house. But comparative on our side of the house, the elves want doubt about the peaceful way, because this is pretty justifiable for them, even and with the compliance of the ancestor's story. Therefore, you can have the easy to unite, and it can reach to the end goal can be achievable on our side of the house. So last thing I want to talk about is the even if cases. Even if we admit the entire scenario of the government side of the house, like they can use that variant as a DPM DLO talking about, the outcome is miserable, because the analysis of the elf is they have the story by the ancestor. They have the identity to the making the toy by the dictation by the Santa, which means if the any power flip into the Santa, it can lead to the identity crisis of the elf. So this means even if you take that as best scenario in Gulf side, we override them, because we prove this is the bad thing for the elves interest. So you have to care the negotiation is better comparing to any other form of the violence they have to claim. Happy to oppose.
I think your book is in the already.
Oh, I'm audible right now.
Oh yeah, you're audible.
Government said we might take non-violent stance. We might take violent stance. We say we won't take violent stance. We take non-violent stance. In that sense, I think we both agree that non-violent stance is good. Then we say violence is bad. They say violence might be good. Then the only issue here is that if violence is good or not. In that sense, we would say if the elves have make some implication to use violence against Santa, the things get worse. Then what's likely to happen in the Santa house is that Santa will be more suppressive to elves. On this point, what government have said? Government said, Santa treat elves in a good way. Because, first of all, they want elves to work. But second, if Santa hit elves, that memory lasts for a long time among elves, and Santa wants to avoid. I think the later, the reason is nonsense, because I don't think how this analysis is just purely objective. I don't know like if Santa thinks exactly the same as like the DPM says. And also, well, first of all, they said that they want elves to work. Yes, we agree. I think Santa wants elves to work, but they can Santa can let elves to work with the bad treatment. For example, like as I have said, monitoring the elves in a more like suppressive way, or for example, don't never like letting them allowed to have any conversation with other elves and so on. And this is all totally aligned with the interest of Santa, which is like they want the elves to work. I don't know why like Santa is so good person that's like they allow like them to have like any conversation and have any chance to like make a next plan of revolution, which might be so dangerous for Santa. So most likely and most clever way for Santa is to be more suppressive against elves. And there's literally no response from government side. Then, on the issue of if this revolution will succeed or not, their logic was like, Santa is weak, therefore we can beat them. The reason was like, for example, one, Santa is old. That's why we're scared of the Santa, right? Because like Santa is old. That means maybe he's like 1,000 years old. That means that Santa has very, very strong life power. That means like it's so hard for the elves to like go like against with the Santa. Maybe they're threatened by the aura of Santa. But second, they said, they are one person. That's why we are scary, right? Because like, they like send like any like present to the all over the world, and through one night. That not necessarily implies he have this special power to send something with a so like high speed to any place. That means that they can like send, for example, this phone to me with the so like high speed that necessarily kills me. But third of all, they said, the reason why like elves don't go outside of the factory is not because Santa they're scary of Santa, but they just believe in the myth. I think this is nonsense, right? Because this logic doesn't like, necessarily implies that like, Santa don't have any mystery power. I think Santa still have any mystery power. And also they said the reason why Santa is strong is because the deer is strong. But the Santa owns deer. They can like use deer to clean like elves up, right? I think all the reason why the Santa is weak from government side is all nonsense. While we explained this how Santa is strong and how elves are weak, they said. But also the biggest issue with the elves of the house is that as they proved that elves are strong, that supports our argument, because as elves are strong, from the Santa's eyes, they can obviously see how like elves can kill Santa, or for example, in the situation where like elves implies using the violence, maybe Santa is so like afraid of the existence of the elves and future possible revolution again, and therefore what will happen is that the Santa used his mystery power with the maximum extent to clean up elves. So we should not like imply any like use of violence. We just have to like the show or stance to just negotiate. Therefore, we should not be violent. Thank you.
I think the reply. I think I've replied with them already.
Sorry. 3, 2, 1. The issue with opposition, I think, throughout this debate is that they just try to continuously co-opt every single new kind of impact we give them by saying that Santa can be kind and Santa will be understanding and Santa will be Jesus. I just don't think this is actually going to work, and I think my reply speech will try to poke holes in how this kind of case shift throughout their entire team is going to actually, is just inconsistent with the end strategy of their case. So the first thing I want to just talk about is make an observation about their case. So their case is basically they are going to make a lot of peaceful negotiations. On a first definitional level, I just don't think it is unfair. I just think it's fair for us to be able to defend a world in which we also pursue peaceful mechanisms, not just because of the fact that, as we pointed out, revolutions can happen for many causes, but second of all, it is just a realistic depiction of how revolutions happen, right? It doesn't start off from people shooting guns. It starts off from slow kinds of negotiations, and when things don't work, things like negotiations and agreements become severed, then you begin to use things like guns. So I think the kinds of characterization we had is just something that is quite realistic and not something they can just be like, oh, definition is wrong. So I don't think they can really co-opt this in order to get exclusivity. The second thing I want to point out is that their entire case strategy is sort of relies on this idea of it has a massive tension in their case, right? Because in order for opposition to be able to get any kind of negotiations, in order for them to be able to make sure that these elves are able to escape this kind of terrible environment of working, which they concede to, and don't pose, which they concede to, they rely on this characterization that DLO explains of Santa being Christian, being the Pope, and being kind, right? This is literally the entire reason as to why they think that you're able to still get these kinds of things. They say the end delta in this debate is the fact that on our side it creates unnecessary tensions and unnecessary kinds of conflicts because you escalate them too quickly. But obviously it relies on the fact that, this person is very kind. But notably, obviously this is against this kind of characterization that they use against us, which is that Santa doesn't care about these people. Santa is likely to be a corrupt person. Santa is likely to have massive amounts of power that he can easily abuse. So obviously if it has to be either one of these characterizations. It is either that their case doesn't work as a strategy, or it is true that this kind of Santa has to be coerced into sort of flipping and accepting this kind of deal. The last thing I want to do in my speech is just be very clear about why our side and what our case was. We told you that this kind of negotiation is likely to be successful in many layers. We told you that elves are likely to unite, that Santa is not that strong, and that Santa is likely to listen. And we told you that Santa is actually likely to listen because of the fact that, first of all, our demands are obviously quite feasible. They're not something that is forcing massive kinds of concessions in terms of economic things. But second of all, I think it's also just true that this is really important as a negotiating factor for Santa, because this is the only way in which he can actually maintain his identity and his reputation. If his production chains are going to be disrupted for a month, for example, that is a massive issue. So Santa is massively risk averse and will try to fold as soon as possible. And I think this is something we uniquely pointed out from first. Third of all, I also think that trade-offs are just too big. We explained to you that this is likely to lead to things like escalation, which leads to a lot of deaths, but also just things like long-term division in the world, and amongst elves and Santa, which is likely to persist for a very long period of time. If Santa is likely to be rational, he's unlikely to want to end up with these kinds of things. The last thing we pushed, and that opposition never actually engages with, is this process being very important. We've pointed out to you, and crucially really nuanced to you, why this kind of catharsis is something that's quite meaningful for these elves. Because of the fact that, first of all, it creates a lot of unity, it creates a sense of common enemy, that is something that is oftentimes very meaningful to a lot of humans, just inherently. But second of all, they have nothing to lose, right? They have no passion for their jobs. They weren't able to choose which kind of jobs to be going into. They were forced into working even at the cost of their family, even at the cost of going to holidays, for example. Obviously, means that they don't really have much autonomy or sense of meaning in their lives. This capacity for them and opportunity for them to be able to talk about this and to be able to show their opinions, even if it leads to some deaths, is likely to be something that's quite meaningful. The case here is very simple. It's very certain that our impacts happen, but it's also something that isn't challenged. This is also going to be a way we can win.